This computer. All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, which I don't know, I think most of the people on the call today, I'm Nikki Galehouse. I'm the Northwest area representative for Colorado APA. I'm also a senior planner with KLJ Engineering. And so I do a lot of code work in my day-to-day life. And as I was looking at Don Elliott's new book, I was like, I want to read this and I want to hold myself accountable to reading it on a regular basis. And before it's been 2 years since he wrote it. And I said, what better way to do that than to host a book club and kind of encourage everyone else to do the same thing and learn from it. And um, yeah, so that's where this event kind of spawned from. And so I reached out to Don, and he was gracious enough to agree to join us for the first and last of the book club sessions to share his knowledge and expertise and be kind of a listening ear for us and walk us through kind of what his approach to the book was. So I'm going to turn it over to him to start, and he'll kind of walk through the book and we'll go through some stuff and have some time for questions as we go. And hopefully everyone's enjoyed starting to read it. I know I did. So, with that, I will pass it over to you, Don.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I'm always pleased when people want to read the book. The uh, this first, I mentioned when Nikki reached out to me, I'm happy to be there at the beginning to kind of orient to why I wrote it the way I did, etc. Um, and I'd be happy to be there at the end, but I don't want to be there in the middle because I think you guys will have a better discussion about things you think are wrong or should have been done a different way or you just disagree with without me there. But I'm happy to be at the end to kind of answer questions that come up in that process. Nikki, we didn't have a chance to talk about before this call, but I also have two or three slides that I won't go through today, but they're more appropriate for the last session in terms of questions that I'd like the group to think about. So I'll forward them to you after this session, and they deal with the whole book, and you can decide whether any of them are useful or not. But and I didn't want to throw them all out today because I'm assuming some number of people haven't read it. So I'm going to spend a while to kind of overview the entire book with some slides. I'm going to count on Nikki to interrupt me when one of you, but please raise your hand or put something in the chat if you want. I'll be focused on my slides, so I won't be looking at that. But Nikki, just interrupt me and say, Don, shut up. We got a question about this. But in general, I'm kind of going to try to take about 45 minutes to uh, overview the entire book, the topics and the general approach, and then stop and say, does anybody have any questions about this writ large, the book as a whole, before, and then pick up after those questions, and then say today's event, today's club meeting said we're going to look at chapters 1 and 2. So I have a couple of 2, 3 slides with more specific things that came out of chapters 1 and 2. If you haven't read them, it'll foreshadow what you're going to read when you get there. If you have read them and you went past that, it'll remind you what was in chapters 1 and 2. And I have some questions about that. So the way I'm planning on doing this is overview, questions and answers about the book as a whole, and then chapters 1 and 2, and an opportunity to discuss 1 and 2. Whether you've read it or not, based on that outline. Now I'm going to share, and I'm going to share the screen, but then you tell me, because I always get it wrong, whether you're looking at my notes version or the display version. And I want to show you the display version, but I never know which one's going to pop up when I do this. So I am going to do this. Can you see the display version? It's without any notes. It's just the cover of the book and my title slide.
Yep, that's what I see.
Okay, great. Okay, then let me get rid of some other things, and I will focus on this so I can look at you. If this actually, yeah, okay. If it looks like this is becoming unstable, then I'll just turn off my video because I'm not sure you need to see me along here. Okay. So an even better way to zone. Some of you know that 15 years ago, I wrote A Better Way to Zone, which was, again, 18 years earlier in my career. And the At that point, I just had some thoughts about how zoning works and doesn't work. What I saw after as a consultant. Those of you who don't know me, I'm a zoning consultant. Just retired, but I counted up. I've written or updated zoning for about 80 different communities in U.S. and Canada, and a little bit overseas in Asia. And at that point, 18 years ago, I had done less of that. And so the book was, I think it's been helpful. It's been used in a number of graduate school courses. It's got a red and white cover, but it was based on general thoughts about zoning and how it could be done better and what assumptions behind zoning um, have turned out to be true and which ones are unhelpful. So this is 18 years later, and it is not a sequel. It is a different kind of a book because, and it's based on the fact that at the end of my consulting career, I thought I knew more. And I also could see patterns that I don't think I was aware of 18 years ago. So interestingly, when I batted around titles for the book, the publisher had a strong preference for this one. Hey, an even better way to zone is that's the best one, Don. And I said, yeah, but then people will think it's a sequel. And the answer is, but it's not a sequel. It goes off in a different direction. It's consistent, I think, but it's not an updated version, and it tries not to repeat what was in that earlier book. But let's just start talking about what it is. So I wrote it because, uh, unlike most countries, almost all of the things we do about land use are done at the local level. And that is even true in Colorado, whether you support the 2024 limitations on local powers related to zoning or not. It is still true that the vast majority of decisions are made at the local level. And often, I was on a planning board, often they're made by people who are appointed and mean well, and elected officials often come out of the planning board, they mean well, but they don't have much of a grounding in how zoning works. I found this a couple of years ago. The world of people who want to fix zoning is very large. The world of people who understand how zoning works is not nearly that large. And if you want to fix it, you kind of have to know how it works. So, and again, the second reason is because public pressure is a major thing here. I was in planning board meetings, and I've been in many city council meetings where discussions are very heated. We want our citizens involved in local government. They get involved. They often get involved either strongly pro change or, in a few cases, often strongly anti change. So these same people who make a lot of the decisions, elected and appointed officials, are subject to a lot of pressure to do what the people in front of them want them to do tonight, regardless of whether it is in the community's best interest or they're going to wish they did it 5 years ago, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. So once again, this pressure to make me happy tonight is often in great tension with how zoning can work to get community goals. And this is why I've been a zoning consultant. I came to the conclusion several years ago, the world is not short on good comprehensive plans. I'm not minimizing their importance. They're very important. But the world is very short on code and incentive reforms and procedural reforms that make those plans happen. And so the point of planning boards, in my mind, and the point of the book is, don't forget zoning's power to achieve the things you said you wanted to do in the long run. And that often means not doing what people in the room want you to do in the short run. So the book hopefully is intended to support long-term, community-wide, overall benefit thinking. And again, after the last 20 years of my career, I thought I knew some things and had spotted some patterns that I had not spotted in the earlier book, that I thought would be worth sharing. So that's why. So it is not a sequel to the first book. It focuses on three particular things. And the reason I chose these is because when I go out and rewrite zoning codes for communities, I find the number one, Don walks in and says, why do you want to rewrite your zoning? And the number one reason is we want it to implement our comp plan. We say we have these great goals for the community, and more often than we'd like to admit, our zoning is preventing us from getting those goals done. Aren't they supposed to work together? So item number one, implement our comp plan. Item number two, make it much more understandable to the average citizen, because right now in most zoning codes, it is not understandable to a normal citizen. And God forbid, in some cities I've worked at, you better not even start a zoning issue or get involved in a zoning dispute without somebody to help you, because you're going to need a lawyer. You're going to need a facilitator. You're going to need somebody who has friends in the city government. And so I, I want to do that's number one and two. Three, four, and five are on this slide, almost regardless of what the comp plan says that people want implemented, other than these. And other than simplifying the code to make it more understandable, people want more affordable housing, they want more sustainable development, and they're increasingly focused on the equity of zoning for disadvantaged communities. You could disagree, and one of the questions I'll ask later is, do you agree? You should think about that at the end of the book. If you had to choose three things, are these what you'd choose or not? I chose them because I do believe, frankly, our firm, Clarion Associates, never in the last 10 years has seen an RFP that didn't ask for more affordable housing. To my surprise, sustainability and resilience has remained current, and I find the triggering event was Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth back in the day. That's now 25 years ago. That's a quarter of a century. We've gone through the crash of 2008. We've gone through a COVID pandemic and disinvestment and a disruption in our development systems. And guess what? Most communities still want their new code to promote a bunch of values related to sustainability and resilience. Meaning they want it. They're aware wildfire risks are greater. They're aware that environmental risks are greater. They're aware that more travel leads to more greenhouse gases. Yes, electric cars help, but no, it doesn't solve the problem. And so they want, and they're aware of food system issues. And so a little bit of my surprise, this has turned into a more or less evergreen issue. Affordability, at some point, if we produced enough housing, maybe that would be less of an issue. I don't predict that happening any sooner. Sustainability has been there for a long time. The more recent one is equity for disadvantaged communities, because more and more cities are aware, at least the advocates that have pushed to rewrite their zoning ordinances are aware that in its current form, zoning tends to lock in opportunities for those who already have more opportunities. It tends to lock in income and wealth disparities that, if we're okay with that, we're okay with that. But in most people I run into don't want to think that that's what their local law is doing. They believe in the statements of opening opportunities, particularly for those that are disadvantaged, particularly for lower income housing, particularly for women-headed houses, particularly for those with disabilities or experiencing disabilities. These are kind of motherhood and apple pie issues. You go home and say, America tries to create new forms of opportunity, and there's an increasing understanding that zoning is one of the things that puts its foot on the brake and makes it harder for people with less to climb the ladder of opportunity or to have the same opportunities that folks with more privilege have. I am well aware that there are people in Washington who do not think this is a real topic and wish we wouldn't talk about it. And that's one of the reasons I put it in here. It is a real topic. We need to talk about it. And unlike federal policy, this is stuff that can be addressed at the local level through zoning. So those are the three focus areas. And the fourth one is to say, I find, and this was a theme in my earlier book too, a lot of zoning implicitly thinks in terms of new development. We write updated landscaping ordinances because we have a significant new development on the outside of the city. And then we apply it to the rest of the city, and it doesn't work very well. Or we raise the bar, but where do you have the opportunity to raise the bar on quality or sustainability or any of these issues? It is generally in a sometimes an edge development, sometimes a pretty large development where any additional costs of raising the bar on quality or environmental sustainability can be spread over a lot of places, a lot of houses, a lot of businesses, a lot of square footage. And I think that's wrong. And if you look at what zoning approvals are made in most cities, 70, 80, 90% are reuse of land that has already been used once, or reuse of a building that's already been used once, or both. And I do think that zoning is not about what do we want this thing to be. It is about what's it going to be next? What should it be allowed to be after whatever is there now becomes functionally or economically obsolete and needs to be redeveloped? Or we put in some more bus lines or transit, and now it has different potential. So I do think there's kind of a static thinking about zoning that says, let's dream about the future. That's great for planning. Trying to write zoning that is based on that dream of the future is misguided because 80, 90% of what is likely to walk in the door and need a zoning or a development approval is going to be reuse of something. And zoning needs to acknowledge that. And what it generally means is you need more flexibility because the opportunities to roll increased costs or raised quality or environmental standards into the development are smaller when you're dealing with smaller infill redevelopment properties and they're more constrained. So I'll talk more about that later. But that's these four ideas are the kind of theme of the book. I like this book, How Buildings Learn. It means buildings over their lifespan change to meet market demands, to meet what the building schools become housing, churches become housing, or schools become offices and salons and galleries. How do they and they change because the way they need to be used changes, and cities are like that. So I show this cover because I think zoning should think similarly. How communities learn, how zoning learns, how our redevelopment opportunity, how it learns to accommodate redevelopment. So the structure of the book is in 9 chapters. They've been divided by Nikki into different classes, and we're dealing today with the first two and the overall. But I've colored these because they're really three different sections. One is just background. Um, I got hired to rewrite zoning because it wasn't working. It was not fulfilling people's needs for their community growth. So the first ones are the dangerous consequences. Yes, zoning is guilty of many things. It doesn't have to be. It it is rules written by human beings that can be rewritten by other human beings. It is not the Ten Commandments. It is not etched in stone. It is politically difficult, but we do politically difficult things all the time when people want to do them. How it works, I'll talk about later on today because I do think they're misunderstanding. And then what's wrong with the current approach, and that'll be the topic of your next chapter. So we're not going to talk about that in depth today, but I identify some thought mistakes about it. The middle three are fixing zoning. What could you do to accomplish more, to get more affordability, sustainability, and equity, particularly in the redevelopment of property as it evolves over time? And I find it helpful, and I have found it helpful for many years to describe zoning saying it's not rocket science. It's a thick book or it's a long website. Um, it's complicated, and unfortunately, the book has many ways to make it simpler, but it's really three things, guys. It's the rules, it's the text and the incentives, what the community is going to reward and what it's not going to allow. It is how do I get an approval? It's the procedures. How do I get a variance? How do I get a zoning approval? How do I get a site plan approval? How do I get a conditional use approval? So it's that, how do I get there? And it's the map. And I find the public can understand zoning better when you think about it as these three pieces. Much of the book is in chapter 4 because if you fix the rules and 5 and the procedures, the map often doesn't need to be changed that much because what you've done is change what's allowed in the zone districts that are already on the map. And maps, frankly, distract people. So I try to do them last because it's easier to get people to think about what's the right, fair, efficient rule for where they want to go when they're talking about rules and rewards or procedures and not the corner of 4th and Main and not the vacant lot at the end of their block. And so maps are the last thing you talk about. And then finally, resolving the tensions. What if the thing you would do to improve affordability undermines sustainability? What if the thing you would do to promote sustainability undermines the equity of the underlying development, makes it more expensive? Now fewer people can afford it. Or it's going to happen. The logical place to do this sustainability thing is in the middle of a low income neighborhood, and they're going to bear the price or the cost of it. So resolving the tensions between different zoning reforms. And then the 8 and 9 are kind of in general, kind of as you think about these changes and the ones that are politically acceptable in your community, how do you roll them in to a functional zoning ordinance and not just staple them on the end and have it all trip over each other? So I'm just going to go through this quick, but we're going to come back to these two chapters. So chapter 1 is the dangerous consequences, history and law of zoning. We're going to come back. But again, these are the four. The only point of this slide is, yes, zoning has racist roots. If you haven't read Color of Law, you need to read it. It is not a coincidence that after the Supreme Court ruled overtly racist zoning unconstitutional, i.e., you couldn't prevent blacks from moving into white neighborhoods or vice versa. And they tried 9 or 10 different ways to do it. Supreme Court overturned it because of the right of contract, not because they cared about black and brown people, but because Don Elliott should have the right to sell his home to anybody he wants to, whether they're black or brown. So it was overruled on contract grounds, not civil rights grounds. But as soon as it was overruled, then we got people arguing for land use zoning. And the line between this is plan B, but if you draft it right, it's going to have the same effect. We can keep lower classes out of upper income neighborhoods. We can keep largely minorities out of other, if you do this right. So the point is guilty, not the only problem. There are many parts of American society and law that have had this effect, and often were overtly designed to do it. I don't want to get into that debate. It doesn't help. The result is the same whether you intended it or not. I think at the time it was intended. Many people, planners and planning officials today would say, "Oh, that's the last thing I intend to do," but and mean it sincerely. But it has those impacts. If it has those impacts, then it's worth addressing, regardless of whether you meant to do it or not. You can have the best incentive in the world, but if it's having bad consequences on the very people you don't want to have bad consequences on, then it needs to be fixed, regardless of what you thought you were doing when you adopted that rule. So it's not the only source of these problems, but it is a source, and chapter 1 admits it. Chapter 2 talks about the DNA of zoning. I'm going to talk about these more, so I won't do it now. It's based on the need to exclude. It excludes very effectively. It cannot make things happen that the market doesn't want to have happen. The market doesn't want to invest. You can't make it happen. You can offer an incentive, but still that incentive has got to get a market person to build it. But it can absolutely prevent something the market wants to happen. It excludes. That's its superpower. And finally, these 3 parts that I talked about earlier. So I'm gonna go through this a little bit faster because we're going to come back to 1 and 2. After a career of doing this with the public, I identified 5 things that I think are common. I call them thought mistakes. They are when people talk about zoning and why it's not achieving what they want it to achieve. They tend to think about it in certain ways that I think are unhelpful. And these are the 5. One, as I said earlier, it tends to be based on what do I want this to be? In an ideal world, what do I want this to be? That's first time development. Most zoning approvals are on land or buildings that have already been developed. That means there's utilities on their ground. They may be in the wrong place. That means the site may be sloping, even though your picture of the site is flat and square. It's not square, it's not flat. Your picture of the site doesn't take into account that what's next door is a very deeply positive use or negative use, which will influence what you can do with this redevelopment or infill site. So we tend, without meaning to think about, just as we do with planning. And I want to be clear. One of the themes of the book is when we do plans, dream. That's exactly what we want you to do. We want you to think carefully, but we want you to focus on where you want to be 20, 30 years from now, even if it seems difficult today, even if it's a pattern change that is going to take a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of good luck to happen. That's what planning is. It's supposed to be fact-based, but you're not supposed to be constrained by the realities of what's on the ground as much as zoning needs to be constrained. In zoning, these are legal rights. And what you allow someone to do with their property is not an idea. It shouldn't be an idea of what that site should have if it had been clean and square and flat and never developed, and you could put the utilities anywhere you want, and the mature trees didn't exist. So it's too focused on a kind of a pure version of what a site like this in this zone district should look like or be. Blank sheet, even when you avoid that, there is, and I'm repeating myself a little bit, even if you say, okay, Don, don't do that. Let's think about infill. Let's get a map of all the infill parcels that would help us promote more walkability, more shorter trips, more safe routes to school, whatever we want to promote. Let's just talk about the infill stuff that's more likely, or the redevelopment types, office buildings that are going to come forward with some sort of a reuse because they're not occupied by offices anymore, or commercial strip centers. Even when we do that, we tend to have an idealized idea that ignores the utilities, that ignores the existing conditions, that ignores the neighbors. I used to think that's what you're supposed to do in zoning. Ignore the neighbors because otherwise you're getting into politics. The truth is, what this site can be in the future is highly constrained by what's already been built and what's around it and what the soil and the land are telling you. And that means if you really want it to be put into reuse, which has a lot of environmental benefits and a lot of social benefits, you need to be more flexible. Wealthy thinking in a lower income world, we tend to like to raise the bar without thinking very much about what will happen if we raise the bar in some zone districts and not others, or we don't think about the fact that that's going to have to be rolled into the cost of redevelopment. Just we good things are not nice things are good, right? Nicer is better, right? Yeah, well, nicer is also more expensive at a time when the percentage of people who can afford to pay for nicer is not a big, is a shrinking percentage of the US population. Slow thinking in a faster world, we're very prone to adding steps in our procedures. Uh, and frankly, it drives up the cost of everything we do. We thump the table and say we need more affordability, and we use processes that are going to make it less affordable. And so many planners and many citizens, many elected officials, I think really have a very poor understanding of how much the time it takes you to get a development approval will affect the affordability of what's done and who can actually afford to do this, whether it's reuse or new development. And then finally, picture book thinking in a real world. I said this in the first book and I still remain it. Pictures are wonderful for conveying zoning concepts. When in an infill and redevelopment issue, when it's not a pure blank slate that you can draw, and most of what we do is not that, it's not a blank slate. Pictures tend to go beyond just conveying zoning ideas, and they lead people to think you can design this infill site to be what you want it to be, and it won't get approved unless it looks like this. Now, I want to be clear. I've put images of typical zoning developments in different zone districts in almost every code I've written in the last 15 years. I'm not against the pictures, but they always have a disclaimer, almost always have a disclaimer that say these are not regulatory. And frankly, when you're dealing with infill, sometimes it would be helpful not to have a picture at all, because I had a guy tell me years ago, said, Don, most development is net fishing. You build something the market wants, and a certain number of fish will swim into your net. You'll sell it, you'll lease it, and that's what you need to stay in business. Redevelopment is spear fishing. I need to see something that no one else saw as an opportunity to put this land to use. Well, if that's true, you can still have guardrails. It can't be too tall, it can't be too big. But the bottom line is, you may not be able to draw a picture of it today. The only way if this land was easy to reuse in an idealized picture, it would have been reused by now. If you want it reused or redeveloped in a way that promotes the community's values, you're going to have to allow for more flexibility, which means it ain't going to be something you can draw a picture of ahead of time. So those are 5 thought mistakes. Chapter 4 is where we fix the rules. And I know you're going to spend some time on this. These are the 3 key goals. And this is the longest chapter in the book because it talks about what specifically could you do to promote affordability, equity, and sustainability. There is a separate chapter at the end. Maybe I should have put it at the end of the book. That kind of takes on this idea that, and I'll be very honest with this group. We had a very good book written a while ago. It's John Nolan's book called Arbitrary Lines, where he argues that zoning is so broken, we should get rid of it altogether. Well, I don't politically think that's going to happen. But I also think his real argument is, what's wrong with Houston? They use restrictive covenants and they are doing well. They're doing better than some places in terms of housing affordability and homelessness. I think many people would argue they're not doing very well on sustainability, but the market hums right along, and they have had 2 chances to replace their restrictive covenant system with zoning, and they've repealed both of them. The citizens are content, and the city leaders are content with this alternative approach. And this blue highlighted portion of chapter 4 is where I say, I don't think this works. It's conceptually an interesting idea. In practice, there are at least 4 reasons why I don't think it'll work. And that's not today's topic. So when you get there, just realize when we talk about improving, the top of this is fixing the rules and the rewards. This is not the map. It's not the procedures. It is about the text of the zoning. What can you do? What can't you do? What can you do after a conditional approval? And what do we offer you as incentives to do what we want you to do? And in that context, the rules and the incentives, restrictive covenants are not the answer. I'm happy to discuss that at the last meeting if you want to talk about it after you've read the chapter. Affordability, basically, I don't want to go too much here, but I have divided this into housing production strategies, affordability strategies, meaning subsidies or inclusionary zoning requirements for affordability, and housing preservation strategies. Most of what we talk about in legislation and in zoning is housing production. Should we allow duplexes where we don't now? Should we allow ADUs? Should we allow missing middle in single family neighborhoods? All of those are talking about production of new housing. That's good, but the US housing stock expands by 1 to 2% a year. That first bullet up there, okay, so you won the battle. You got missing middle housing in single family homes. That is a very slow lever because it's going to affect a percentage of 1 to 2% of the current housing stock. It's not a big number. It's worth doing, but it's partly because why we think about zoning being about something new rather than what's there. Affordability strategies is a portion of this that just says no matter what you do in allowing different kinds of zoning under the current and foreseeable economic structure of the United States, there's going to be people in the 0 to 40% AMI that are not going to be able to afford it, even with trickle down, even with, you know, really liberalizing what can be happening. Um, we are going to need some subsidies in indirect or direct. And so that part of the chapter talks about how, and the pitfalls of getting it wrong and the realities of what kind of incentives you need to offer if you really want it to work. And by the way, they're big. If you really want to get incentives to get poor people into housing, whether it's new or old, they're big. Little ones don't work. And finally, preservation, which is the 97% of the housing, of the buildings that'll be here next year, that's already here. And you can go out into the future, 90%, 80% of the buildings we'll have a decade from now are already here. So this talks about how we can try to preserve the existing affordable housing that we have, because once it's torn down, yes, I'm tearing down a bungalow that's very affordable, but don't worry, I'm building a fourplex or I'm building a 10plex of which one will be affordable. That new affordable unit, I almost guarantee you, will not be as affordable as the one you tore down. So the question is, I think we should, it's not a question. The recommendation is we should be talking more about using zoning to preserve the existing housing stock that is affordable. I was just on a webinar earlier this morning with the Lincoln Housing Institute and the Pew Charitable Trust are really pushing more use of manufactured housing because it is the most affordable housing stock we have. And if you allow it to be taken out and redeveloped for even multifamily housing with a 10% affordability or a light tech project, it is not going to be as affordable as what you just tore down. So zoning can prevent redevelopment that will take away the most affordable housing that we have now. And that section talks about it. I'm not going to talk about the details here. I'm moving on to 4.2. This is the equity. How do we get zoning to create more equitable zoning outcomes? And the first part of this chapter just talks about equity working through affordability. I was one of 8 authors that helped draft, I think we got a cover here, there it is, the Equity and Zoning Policy Guide, which is an APA policy guide, which is their official positions on how zoning, as opposed to planning. They have a separate one on planning to improve equity, and then they have one on zoning to improve equity, and I was one of the 8 authors of that. And what we kept coming up to often and often when we looked at examples of how zoning was limiting opportunities for disadvantaged populations, it is through affordability. When things get less affordable, those who pay the highest price are exactly those who we don't want to hurt in our economy in terms of opportunities. It sounds simplistic. I think it is actually a key fact to understand in the zoning requirement. We need to be very careful about the equity impacts of things we do that raise development costs. And finally, this chapter talks about how, even though we all talk about housing, No one can afford to buy a house. Nobody can afford to build wealth through a house. The way we have segregated our communities prevents those with less income from locating where the good schools and the good public services are. So it tends to be a housing conversation, but that's not all that there is in equity. There's employment opportunities. You can make it harder for lower income and disadvantaged populations to get to the jobs, and we do. Access to quality public services and public health risks. All of those are equity. And the point of this chapter, it has in each of these topics, it says, and here are the types of changes you could make that would address this issue. So that's equity. Improving sustainability. Obviously, I start off with this one, which is kind of the underlying point. Just we do a very poor job of avoiding climate risk areas. It doesn't matter whether you think humans have caused climate change or not. There are more wildfires. There's more flooding. We don't deal with coastal issues here in Colorado, but we do deal with a lot of flooding and wildfire issues. And we are extraordinarily reluctant to limit development in those areas. That'd be a taking. Well, many times it's not a taking, but it does limit your ability to build a dream home on this particular lot that is very likely to result in damage or injury. Guys, this is public health and safety. This is what zoning is supposed to be doing, not having development that we will regret having approved. And we've already approved a lot of it. I read a study years ago, 80% of the homes that could be built in wildfire prone areas in the West have not been built yet. So let's just think here. We're going to allow those homes to be built in high risk wildfire areas. And the answer, if you're okay with that, because I'll say this and then regret it, because we worship at the altar of property rights, okay. But I'm not okay with that. That is not how local government's supposed to work. And frankly, it's not how the federal government or the state government's supposed to work. If government's supposed to do anything, it is to prevent public health and safety, to protect public health and safety. We do this for floods. We do it very badly, but we acknowledged years, decades ago, it is not wise to allow you to build things in floodplains. Yet any second grader could understand that. And we have a system to prevent it from happening. And we don't for wildfire, but we could. And so this is part of what this is. But then, and this is their APA has a guide on this. And when we talk about this, there are about 5 things zoning can do. There are a lot of things zoning can't do. It can allow mixed use, which reduces travel times and improves walkability and bikeability. You can improve connectivity for the same purpose. You can allow more types of renewable energy and the transmission of renewable energy. I was on another, just so happens that I was on 2 webinars today, where the whole topic on the second one was the fact that in some states, energy demand is predicted to double in the next several years. That can't happen under our current federal or state or local regulatory systems. And the question is, all 3, it's not who bears the blame. All 3 are going to have to change. Almost every code I wrote in the last 20 years of my career widened the opportunities for renewable energy, both community scale and accessory and industrial scale. Guys, this is a major issue for everybody. So renewable energy and then food production. Frankly, local food production is not going to save the world. It's a minor issue, but if you don't address it, you're going to have people just asking you, why haven't you addressed it? It's not hard to address. Every code I've written in the last 20 years opened up new opportunities for food production too. Local food production, including the sale of it, including the local small scale production of food products. It's not hard to fix, but you have to focus on it. And so each one of these areas, again, the book says, here's what you could do to get at these things. And here's some facts that will hopefully help you get the public to agree with you. Here, the restrictive covenants are not the answer. You'll get to that when you get to it, so I'm not going to do, but you can see what I said. You're using a tool that is currently used to exclude even more than zoning to get at the fundamental problem of zoning, which is that it excludes. There's a difficult conversation there as to whether that's the right way to deal with it. They're not drafted to a public process. I know. There are lots of languages that are adopted. These are private club agreements. And Still, many of them, even today, say no group homes in residential neighborhoods. That's illegal under federal law and state law. You can't enforce that. But and if it was a public zoning ordinance, I could never get that adopted. That's illegal. You can't do that. But under a private covenant that nobody's reviewed, you can do that. It's difficult to get a whole coverage of the community like it is for zoning. Zoning covers entire communities. Restricted covenants do not. And finally, you'd have to completely change the enforcement mechanism, which Houston has. Most cities do not want to get into enforcing covenants. Houston will. But that's a major change in enforcement opportunities because right now, the only way to enforce a covenant is to you, as a citizen, sue your neighbor to stop them from doing what they're doing. That's a really expensive and time consuming and cumbersome way to run land use for an entire community. So those are my 4 reasons. Procedures. I wanted to, I'll go through this pretty quick because I'm taking a little more time than I thought. Understanding the legal framework. In A Better Way to Zone, the first book, I talked through the key principles that constrain what you can and can't do through zoning. Here, I just hit the top points and say, if you really want to read all of that, you can look at the other book. I don't want to repeat things twice. But it talks about regulatory takings and it talks about due process and equal protection in the First Amendment. Kind of, guys, if you have to draw a box and say, what should I worry about? That's what you should worry about. A lot of things you shouldn't worry about. Um, Clarifying the role of the public, I'll show you a slide on that in the meantime. I expect to get yelled at for this, but I have not been so far. The public does not need to be involved in every zoning decision. They should not be involved in every zoning decision. And that's, I tried to put a defense of that. Many, they should be. Some, they should not be. And the faster we realize that, the better results we're going to get. And finally, reducing what I call the negative trifecta: time, expense, and unpredictability. So I've here's a quote. Do you guys, anybody know who made this quote? If you want to look like you did something good without risking anything will change, adopt a good zoning rule and a complicated zoning procedure to apply it. I know you all read this in planning school, probably. Do you remember who said it? I did. So that's my statement. It's not planning school. It's just I guarantee you, when I saw it in Denver, you want to say you've dealt with ADUs and you make every one of them have a separate parking space and you make them get a rezoning to do it. Good. You can declare victory with great assurance that you will not get any ADUs because you've made the process so hard that nobody's going to do it, or so unpredictable that somebody's going to do it. So here are the things I just went through, and it's a combination of these 2 things. And by the way, there is a Colorado Land Planning and Development Law, the old Green Book. A new one is supposed to be coming out from Recommend Land Use Institute. Should have come out a year ago, but it's in process. Here's my, what I thought would be a controversial table. When you talk about zoning decisions, I created a transect in a different kind, saying on the left-hand side are big deals: community-wide zoning, a new code, a new zoning map. Then there's neighborhood, an overlay for transportation or for transit-oriented development. Or topics. We have new rules on ADUs. We have, or large development approvals. This is a big unused parcel. It's hundreds of homes, or tens of thousands of square feet of commercial. Site-specific rezoning. Don wants his property rezoned. Nikki wants her property rezoned. Then conditional use approvals and site-specific property. I don't know how many places in Colorado do this. The bigger cities don't usually do this. That right hand, you can see where the action is. I admit, first row says, how valuable is public input? It peters out towards the right. And then the next column says, how likely is it? People's narrow interest in their block, and I call it narrow. I get it. Your block is what you care for most. I live on a block. I care what happens on my block. But at what is the risk that what you will do to defend that will undermine where the community wants to go as a whole? Very low in general, because people can draw on the better instincts of their nature. I can come up with a good rule. I can come up with a fair. We can all agree on how we should run this. When you get into other types of development, other things, the risk on the right-hand side, the risk of self-interest defeating a conditional use approval for a particular property, I say it's high. I don't want that here. Yes, I agree. We need more childcare. I don't want it here. I agree we need more elderly services near where the elderly are, but I don't want it here. And the same thing for site-specific project approvals. When do I get to look at the architecture? I think the balconies should face north rather than west. And the answer is, if you comply with zoning, subdivision, and you have submitted an application that meets these things, the risk of people undermining where they said they wanted to go because of their narrow self-interest is high. And the value of having a public debate about a single site that meets zoning requirements because you want to discuss whether it's compatible or high quality is very high. So here are the 5 things I've said: reduce individualized study requirements, public hearing, vague and subjective review, administrative adjustments, and appeals. Finally, there's a chapter on fixing the map. Unredlining is a very sexy thing to talk about. It is very difficult to do without hurting the very neighborhoods that have been hurt by the redlining in the very people and their children and their children's children. Who was hurt by this? Generations of people. Where do they live now? We don't know. Some of them live there, some of them don't. Some of them have moved somewhere else. A geographic way to try to fix the map to erase redlining is a very complicated process. And you're probably, look at the bottom bullet, it is not effectively done in most cases through zoning. There's a lot of damage that can be done. There is some good that can be done, but it's a chapter that says, there's also a chapter saying don't focus on overlay districts. There's other ways to do this. Okay, I'm going to do this quickly. There's a chapter on resolving the tensions. What happens when something you're promoting to solve one of these goals runs into another one? Kind of talks about some principles. Here are the principles of resolving the tension. Don't forget to focus on the most vulnerable. We generally try not to do that. The discussion needs to be taking place about the impact at the neighborhood level, not just the wealthy neighborhoods, but the poor neighborhoods. The idea, you need to promote the idea that there are no safe sanctuaries. There's no part of our city that is immune from the need to adjust to future demands, including housing demands, including increasing opportunities for lower income and disadvantaged persons. This can be done. I mean, people's instincts are, well, stay away from the single family zoning districts. That's just, you're going to die on that hillside. People do it regularly, but it is an educational issue to say, look, this is a community or a regional issue. We cannot do this by ensuring that you are not going to be affected by it. There is no such thing as a you that will be not affected by the need to change, to evolve, to meet these goals. And then you can read the rest of these. Finally, 5 key principles on generally how to incorporate them into your code. And I'll stop there and say, before we go on to chapters 1 and 2, are there questions about any of this? Are there questions about what it covers, why it covers? Let's just open it up. And if not, Nikki will ask me some questions, I guess.
I was going to say, also just feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Keep it pretty informal for this.
I guess I'll start. This is probably a really broad question, but do you talk about the tensions between the sustainability and the affordability? So I work in the wildfire space, and the biggest thing is this is not affordable. And so that's kind of that tension of safety and affordability and that balance is something I'm very interested in.
Well, again, I think this chapter on resolving the tensions, I think is helpful. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because the problem is not that we don't have good ideas. We have good ideas. They just run into other good ideas. And so I would say that there is no single answer, and this chapter talks at length, maybe at too much length, about the fact that how these focus areas turn out will differ from neighborhood to neighborhood. But I think that one of the ways that I have worked on that tension, affordability versus fire safety, is twice or 3 times I've said, look, these are platted lots. People have a right to do something with them. If we added sprinkler requirements, or we required other things to be happening, we would be driving up the cost of the housing they have already expect to be able to build. The alternative would be, and again, I'm just throwing out an idea. In 3 different codes, I've said, fine, you can build, but you can't build anything bigger than 700 and 800 square feet. I'm not going to make you sprinkler it. I'm going to say, and that, well, Don, that's not my dream house. That's a cabin. I can't live there. Answer, right. I didn't increase the cost by development costs. I said, this is a place where you have a property right, and you had an expectation that you would build a dream house. And that expectation was not reflecting the wildfire risk in that area. So you do have a property right. And that's been upheld by the courts in a number of places. The right to build a house is not the right to build whatever house you feel like you should be able to build in that area. And so I'm just, I know you threw out the question as an example of this tension. And one of the answers is uh, if you've got the political will, Pitkin County, which is not very affordable, has said for decades, you may have a property right to build on that old mining claim that you bought from some guy in a trailer. I don't know. There's a debate between whether those are buildable lots or not, but we're going to say you can't build it, but we give you a development right to sell it off of that, so you'll get some compensation. But in that very wealthy community, and though it's conservative once you get outside of Aspen, sometimes they've kind of said no, they will in certain cases allow you to build a cabin, but they'll also offer you the right to sell the development rights to that cabin to try to avoid the property rights and takings argument, but you just reduce the amount of stuff they have in the wildfire areas. So those are just a couple of examples.
Thanks.
I didn't say this was easy or popular, but
No.
other questions just in general about the book. Let me ask this. If you, based on your various careers, if you were to choose three topics, I chose affordability, sustainability, and equity. Is there a fourth one or one that you think is more important than those that you would have said, e.g., if I wrote this book, I would have done something else? I would have focused on some other topics.
Don, I really appreciated you incorporating the kind of fourth element there with regard to kind of changing of use and redevelopment. I think that you're kind of spot on in how communities treat and look at non-conforming sites, non-conforming structures, and keeping that, I think, in the forefront of kind of how we look at zoning is really important to our communities overall. So I appreciate that you had the foresight to include that piece.
Good.
I did have a question on your kind of matrix, Don, with regard to kind of where and when does the community get involved?
Yeah,
Um,
good.
and I'm sure there's, a wide range of opinions on this, but I was curious if you could kind of speak to a little bit kind of the categorization specifically for like the site-specific rezoning conditions and the large development approvals
Yeah.
with regard for
Mhm.
what you've classified kind of a high need for public input, because I think those are two areas where we oftentimes see communities, that are opposed to a very site-specific rezone, coming unglued. So I
Mhm.
was curious on kind of your thoughts on why including those in a high versus maybe a mixed or low category.
Uh, so you're talking about the first row or the second row? First row?
The first row with regard to kind of the need,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
ensuring that,
Yeah.
the site-specific rezoning was a high category, for example.
Yeah. That's interesting. I did it because in many states that's the kind of the state law, and you need to do it. But the truth is, you're the second person to ask me that question and say, why isn't it at least mixed? And that there are communities out there that have put that into a mixed category or a low category and said that one in particular, site-specific rezoning. And even though it may be unpopular, my experience on the Denver Planning Board was related to this. In Denver, during the 6 years I was on there, Denver is a very unusual system. It has many problems. Nevertheless, one of the things it does well is put density near transit, which I think is a long-term game that our children and our children's children will thank us for. So what it does is to say, when you do a site-specific rezoning, and we did two or three every planning board meeting, we recommended them, we didn't approve them, but almost all the council almost always agreed with planning board on these things. And Denver's criteria was, is it consistent with the plan? And if you came in with your neighbors to say 267 of us oppose this because of parking, traffic, schools, strangers in my alley, planning board, those are not criteria. Planning board cannot recommend denial based on any of those things. The overriding one, there were other criteria, but they were interpreted to be basically they were involved, but they were not able to thwart an application that was consistent with the comp plan. And the answer is, well, what if traffic really is too high? Well, if traffic really is too high, then your 8-story zoning is going to be limited by the traffic guys to 6. They're going to do it administratively. They're going to say, look, you can't get people in and out. So you've got 8-story zoning. That's not a guarantee of 8 stories. It means that's your max. But you can, so the example I'm going into is basically Denver in our own state. It's a disliked example because it's the big bad Denver. But the bottom line is they have if this was filled out for Denver, Denver would say site-specific rezonings are really not a high need for public involvement. They're mixed. We have designed our criteria so that they're either low or mixed. The bottom line is, did you propose something consistent with our plan? So,
Yeah, that's
I
helpful.
would,
Certainly, my experience would kind of fall in that same category, right? Maybe this is mixed, but really the community-wide rules and incentives is where many of those options and kind of need for public engagement,
Mhm,
I guess, get
mhm.
more highlighted. Um, and then kind of similar, I was surprised to see, for example, in your bottom row there of risk of self-interest, that both the large development approvals and site specific were a medium with regard to, I think we'd often see that a much higher propensity for those to be high with regard to risk of self-interest.
I love it. I love it. No, Al, maybe I pulled my punches too much. I thought I'd be yelled at for including any mixed or high, and here the planners are telling me there ought to be more mixed, and there ought to be, more high risk of self-interest and more low risk for public involvement. So no, you read it carefully, Tamara. Maybe I pulled my punches too
I have
much.
a kind of follow-up question to that. Like, so if you think about that, a lot of communities are more on the low or mixed on the need for public input on something like a site-specific decision. How do you balance that with the public's opinion that their need for public input because of the risk of self-interest there, I think is probably high. Like they probably consider themselves to have that as a much higher need. Um, and when you're describing like you've got succinct criteria, does that make sense?
Yeah, well, right, writ large, what I found, and again, book is based kind of on my experience, is that people's expectations of when they'll be involved in zoning decisions can be changed over time. I mean, until 2010, Denver citizens were involved in every zoning decision, and they often vetoed them. Um, in 2010, they adopted a policy which has been unpopular with council, but they haven't repealed it yet. That basically says where you don't. So the public has adjusted to that. And the other example I would give is some of the cities I've worked in that have basically annual citizens planning academies or citizen zoning academies where every year you do, here's how we do subdivisions, here's how we do zoning, here's how we do site plans, here's how we do. And you just educate people over and over again on the fact that this is at the planning stage, great. At the wide zoning stage, fine. Here's when we don't allow public involvement. So you need to be weighing in at these areas. But the problem with that, it's not a problem, it's a challenge. If you adopt that, the cities that do it consistently tell me that it changes expectations and people can live with it. They understand this is too late. This is too late. This application meets the requirement. You don't like it, but we missed our opportunity to deal with that at some earlier stage in time, either the overall development plan or the community plan or the neighborhood plan. It's too late. This city's policy is we have rules and we have incentives. And when you submit something and you're consistent, we approve it. So it's too late to do it now. And that sounds mean, but the cities that do it have found that it can work. But you have to do it every year because every year the HOA chair changes and every year the planning board changes. And every year those who are not happy, the new arrivals come in and you can't make them come. But again, I've had maybe 4 examples in my career of cities that said, if you do it regularly, they got it. They understood. They understood why we don't allow public engagement there. Yes, they got it when they lived in Kansas City, they had it. They live here and they don't get it. They understand. So, so, so public expectations can be changed.
Don, I've got a question for this.
I found that,
you,
I'll just say one.
oh,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, please continue.
No. I didn't know you were trying to say something. Go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question on this. I know you've talked a lot about City of Denver in this. Do you find that kind of that risk of self-interest kind of changes based on community size scale, where all of these risks of self-interest kind of increase in small town communities where it's
Yes,
really hard to
absolutely.
to bifurcate your own self-interest from whatever the community-wide rule or incentive is. And so I wasn't sure if you kind of dive into that in your book a little bit of the big city versus the small town kind of viewpoint on this.
Yes, I do. I do. In 2 ways. One, right at the beginning, right at the introduction or the preface or something, I do talk about the fact that most of my experience has been in medium and large size cities. So the recommendations are based on that. And it's very true what you just said. You live in a city of 700,000, you're not going to get your way all the time and you're not going to be able to be involved in everything. And Denver City Council understands, even, I don't agree with their decisions, but they understand their job is not to make everybody happy all the time. You can't run a city of 700,000 that way. And so when you're in a smaller community, the expectation is, and people self-select. They don't want to live in Denver. They wanted to live in a place where they had direct access to their elected officials or the risk of dense development was lower. So yes, it does do that. However, I also talk in the book about how, one of the values almost everybody does agree with is kind of the need for efficient, predictable government. And that's not a value only of large communities. Nobody wants their government wasting money. Very few want a system in which their government wastes time. Some of them would like to have more unpredictability in it, meaning if we're all mad about it, we can stop it. But the bottom line is I make the point in the book, and I think it applies to smaller communities just as well as large ones. Zoning is not a popularity contest. It is not intended to allow you to design your neighbor's development. It never was. It is a system of governance. And that systems of governance have some basic principles as to what constitutes good governance. Efficiency is one of them. Equity is one of them. Not wasting money is one of them. Affordability of the process is one of them. And even though the outcomes will be different in small communities, and this table might even be different for a small community, you're right about that. I think the logic behind, when I say in any community, this code should tell you what you can do with your property, what you can't do with your property, how you go about changing that. And that system should implement your comp plan. I get 100% nodding. It is in the design of the governance system, people's goals are very similar. In local governments, they may still, the predictability part of it, they may value less. The bigger the city, the more the development community and the citizens understand, look, I don't want a different answer for different people with different projects just because of the neighborhood they're in. That's not right. In smaller communities, I think there's less buy-in to that principle. But so the short answer is I do dive into it in some ways, but I also kind of try to paint this picture of zoning as law, guys. There are principles to fair and equitable laws, and they include predictability. And zoning is not very good at acknowledging that principle of, in my mind, how the rule of law should work. So
Thank you.
let me go on to a couple more slides if that's okay, and then we'll have another chance for discussion too. But let me go on just to these two, just to see if it provokes any more answers. I'll do this quickly so we can then just open it up for more discussion of anything you want. So I did talk, the chapter 1 is divided into these 4 topics. By the way, if you haven't read The Color of Law, only one chapter really deals with zoning. It's chapter 4. They talk about our lending practices. They talk about the GI Bill, redlining, varieties of things that happened. Ironically, early in the 20th century, the federal workforce was much more integrated and arguably color blind than it was after Woodrow Wilson took office. So it talks about the whole structure of the American economy and governance system. And what I focus on in this 1.1 is simply acknowledging all of that. I think I needed to do that right up front because I think that's one of the things that the public understands about zoning is, yeah, it's based on redlining. Redlining was wrong. We may benefit from the segregation by class and race that we have today, but we won't say that publicly. And we will, and we do in our hearts believe this was a bad thing to do. A bad thing to base zoning on. Maybe a bad thing to base lending practices on too. So, and then these 3 things. So this chapter doesn't talk about fixes. This one just talks about how zoning has driven up affordability, driven up housing costs, how it has limited opportunities for lower income and minority and disadvantaged populations, and then how it often stifles the very more forms of more sustainable development that we say we want. I bet I couldn't find a comp plan that Denver has written in the past 20 years that didn't mention sustainability. And yet the zoning that gets either adopted or not adopted often makes it so expensive to do new and unexpected things that it kind of locks in what we can visualize as being like what we know, that it basically makes it very risky to propose something that would be more sustainable. I say this example with trepidation because I'm not that familiar with it. I do know that in Douglas County, northern Douglas County, Sterling Ranch, it took years and years and years to adopt. It was not infill. It was a master plan community like Highlands Ranch with a much smaller water consumption. Douglas County is very serious about water because the aquifer is falling. They're not on the Platte. They're not on Fountain Creek. They have water issues. It's groundwater. And so they have among the strictest water documentation. They want to know that the water you say that you have is real water. Someday it'll wind up in a glass. It's not a piece of paper. So they're very strict. They have a long and very complicated chapter. But Sterling Ranch, big piece of land, goes in there and says, we got ways to save water. It took them years to get that adopted. I think now people would look at it and say, good, we should all be conserving water like that. But the fact that they were using innovative practices to try to consume less water and prove that they would consume less water than most people thought was possible, just only a deep pocket, big developer with patient money could possibly get through that. So that's just an example of how our rules in general make it difficult to propose something that is completely in line with what we say we ought to be doing. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, this has 2 slides, and then I'll be quiet. The DNA of zoning, I've said this, I said it earlier in today's thing. The chapter really goes into zoning was designed to exclude. Many of these problems, affordability, equity, and sustainability, have to do with exclusion. We excluded the kind of housing that would make housing more affordable. We excluded renters from the public process, or we excluded low income. The analysis of the trickle-down effects of what we do in single-family zoning on lower income neighborhoods. We didn't think about that. We thought about how nice it looked and how good it sounded, and we didn't realize that if we raise the bar over here, that market doesn't go away. It goes to some other neighborhood that is not going to be able to. We exclude that kind of analysis, or sustainability. We exclude innovative ideas and innovative development. So this I think we have to be careful, because one of the themes of the book, and one of the things I deeply believe, is we have vastly overused the power to exclude. Uh, and the second point you can just see on the slide here is that even though it'd be nice if you didn't have to draw lines, lines are necessary. It's legal rights. If you want to change the zoning line, you got to go through a public process. I have worked in communities that have kind of blurry lines in their future land use map, and they say the zoning has to match the future land use, and then the zoning map still has lines. When you go up to change it, you may be able to say, the line's blurry on the comp plan. I should be allowed to rezone to the following zone. But until you get that change adopted, zoning has lines. It doesn't have fuzzy edges. You could have criteria that say, we'll tend to approve the line moving in the following circumstances, but there's a line that has to be moved. So this is one of the key points that I make throughout the book, is that it was designed to exclude, and we have overused it. After World War II, we realized that if we want more landscaping, we can exclude things that don't have enough landscaping. If we like a lot of parking, we exclude developments that don't have enough parking. Every rule we have excludes something that we didn't want in a particular location. I like to go through with my clients, and I discuss this in the book, the why not question. You can show many communities their permitted use table and walk through it and say, why don't you allow this here? And very often, surprisingly often, no one knows the answer to that question. You'd expect the answer would be, well, the communities wouldn't stand for it. Often, that's not the answer. Often it's like, yeah, well, it's different than what we have, but there are plenty of neighborhoods in this town that have a mix of those things. I don't know why no one asked that question before. No one submitted an ordinance saying we ought to allow that. We have piecemeal amended the ordinances to the point where nobody's looked at the fact that as a whole, this table is wildly inconsistent. And if it has problems, they are probably over exclusion of things on the basis of public health, safety, and welfare that have, in fact, nothing to do with public health and safety, and very little to do with public welfare. So that's this chapter, talking about the importance of understanding zoning keeps things out. Don't overuse that power. It is very tempting to overuse it. Finally, the zoning, the rules, the procedures, and the map. I mentioned that earlier. I'd be interested if any of you have comments on whether that's a good way to think about zoning or not. I view these as in order of importance. That's why in chapter 4, which talks about these, much of it is about the rules and incentives. And then I make the point that procedures are just as important. The map is less important than you think. The map just implements what you've done in the rules and the procedures, the rules primarily. But when I talk to affordable housing developers or sustainable housing developers, and I've talked to a few, but I've talked to a lot of affordable housing developers, and say, what would make this project work for you? Less parking, more height, less design review, less setbacks, more lot coverage? What would make this work for you so you could build more of what we say we want you to build? I had a case, it was 20 years ago, where every affordable housing builder in the room said the discretionary rezoning process or the discretionary site plan approval process. Don, if you could get me into a system where a building that is no bigger or weirder than what your zoning allows automatically goes for site plan approval that is administrative, I would give you all the other stuff. You could have your parking rates. You could have your height limits. You could have your lot coverage limits. I'd like those. They're helpful. They would help me build. But the thing that kills me is the process, because it's time consuming, it's expensive, and the outcome is unpredictable. And if I'm a big developer, I can suck it up, but I'm going to have to roll the costs into the housing. If I'm lucky, maybe. If it's too much, maybe I can roll it. It's corporate profits. I can undersell I can sell the Denver ones at less profit because I can sell the Kansas City ones at a greater profit. Those are not who builds America. D.B. Horton is a big builder, but much more housing and much more commercial development is built by small housing builders and small commercial developers. They cannot stay the course and roll the losses on this project into the profits of the next project or another project. And those are veteran-owned businesses and women-owned businesses and small businesses and minority-owned businesses. When we create these procedures that are time-consuming and unpredictable, that's who you squeeze out of the market. If you meant what you said, that you'd like to have more economic involvement by those people, then you need to simplify your process and your rules because they can't take the time it takes to have an individualized beauty contest or everything that comes forward. So, but the rules itself, and I divide those just so you know into form standards, use standards, and development. I did that because I make the point. I think every zoning code out there is a hybrid, even Denver's, which is a largely form based. It has significant use controls. I've never seen a code that doesn't have both form and use standards. So they're all hybrids. The question is, how do you organize the content and how much do you emphasize form as opposed to use? In most cities, say form is more important downtown and use is more important in the residential neighborhoods. So it's kind of predictable how that works out. But the bottom line is, this is not a problem that a form-based code can solve because every form-based code, yes, if you focused on form and you really meant it and you simplified the use standards equivalently, um, I, I admit in the book, since most exclusion is based on stereotypes about the use, it might be less exclusionary going in the door. But my experience is even form-based codes often have the very same use controls that are based on stereotypes that that use-based controls have. So I drafted it just so that whether people think they have a form-based code or a use-based code, there are specific things you can do to address the three main goals in the book, the four main goals of the book, and and then development standards. Even if you allow the use, if you make it too expensive to build that, or you make it so that only a square flat piece of ground could ever make that work, um, then you're doing it. So they're also that 2.2.3 just goes in and says, okay, here are the kind of development standards to thwart affordability, equity, and sustainability. So look for those. And if you meant what you said, these things you should change. So that's all I've got on this. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on that. I have a couple of questions. I'll put them up here just in the interest of time. Um, I wrote this not for academics. I wrote it for planning officials, city council members, planning students, and planners. I'd be interested as you read the book in knowing whether you think even chapter 1 or 2 does that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as to no, Don, it's still not understandable, or it is. And again, I think Tamara's already weighed in on this number 2, refocusing zoning on redevelopment and reuse and redevelopment. But I'd be interested. Those are just 2 general questions. I have a longer list that I will give to Nikki so that you can use as you want to during the later meetings of this group if you'd like. So, but other than that, I'll just throw it open. Are there anything about the chapter 1 and 2 before you go on to these are kind of the ramp up to the book. So 3 through 8 are the substance of the book. So thoughts, comments?
Hey Don, this is Philip Berry from Garfield County. And one of the interesting things that we deal with a lot here when someone's going through a permitting process is historic issues with their subdivision or plat amendments. Where basically somebody will come in for one thing and they're going to leave my office having to apply for a basic correction exemption to fix that their lot was illegally created or fix that they exchanged property with a neighbor 30 years ago through a BLA instead of an amended final plat. Have you ever seen more efficient processes or steps that governments can take to like fix some of these issues, like in a specific area, or do I just have to figure out ways to expedite these processes even more?
I think there are 2 different answers to that. One is for a particular, first of all, the book acknowledges that in a couple of cases, it delves into subdivision, but it really focuses on zoning. So it's not about that. However, um, my experience has been that there are two different ways of doing that. One is um, you can grant your planning commission, or excuse me, you can grant your staff greater authority to make minor modifications. One of the big things I say that you're pro reuse and redevelopment, but it would affect you in terms of initial development of something that was laid out in ways that don't work today, is to, in the code, authorize your staff to do more things administratively. That's true for zoning. I'd like to get rid of half the variances and say, just let staff do that. And I write my codes that way. Um, if the problem is terrain, if the problem is utility location, if the problem is soils, if the problem is this doesn't make any sense given how tall the neighbor's buildings are or short, staff is authorized to make certain changes administratively as part of the redevelopment process without going for a variance if they document that they can change the following rules by the following amount if the reason is one of these 5 reasons. And I've never had that challenged. I think it's a good idea. That can be done in subdivision too. Interestingly, Colorado says you need a hearing whenever a plat is approved, but they modified it several years ago to allow administrative plat amendments without a hearing in certain cases. I actually think, I know many Colorado counties have just ignored that. They authorize the director or the staff to make a list of minor changes, or they send them up on a consent agenda and say, we're not going to have a hearing about this stuff. It's just, this is technical fixes, guys. And the fallback is it'll go on a consent agenda. The preferred approach is in our subdivision regulations and procedures, we're just going to authorize staff to make those kind of changes by this amount for the following reasons. And I, long before the legislature even amended the final plat ordinance to kind of say in the following cases, if you've had a hearing on the preliminary plat, you don't have to have a hearing on the final plat. I think many Colorado counties were already doing that, and no one's ever sued them. So I'm not aware of any Colorado case that's tried to say, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a case out there, but I can't remember it. So yes, that's it. The other part of the answer is if it's a big development, if it's 50 lots that are not making it or never will be developed because of a flaw or a faulty layout. I participated several years ago in the writing of a book for Lincoln Land Institute called Arrested Development that includes, okay, this is a messed up plat. What are our alternatives to get out of this? What are the examples and the procedures you would use to replat it? And often when it's a lot of lots, you can't do it administratively, but you can do it in an expedited way that doesn't involve rethinking the whole thing and going through another political process. So arrested development is a document that might be helpful to you. Nikki,
Um,
anything?
um, I have one question I kind of want to end on, but before I do, I just want to do a quick thank you and goodbye in case anyone has to drop off since we are just about at 1:30. So I did put the CM number for credits in the chat, and I'll send that out through an email as well afterwards. But thank you to everyone for joining. Our next few sessions will be a little different in format. I'll have some questions prepared, and we'll kind of go through typical book club style type uh, thought questions. So I'm excited for that, but very much appreciate Don you joining us today to kind of give us this kickoff for our reading this book. I think it's going to be a really fun read and very informational and help us think about how we're approaching zoning. So the question I want to leave you with, or before we leave, was how should planners balance acknowledging zoning's exclusionary history while still working within zoning as a tool for positive change?
Exclude less. No, The history is the history. I think I kind of said earlier, I don't really care whether people meant it or not. I think the key is to focus the public discussion on the unintended consequences. Minneapolis has been in the news in the last several years because they made major changes to allow more types of development, more types of housing throughout the city. And when I talk to the planning director and say that was a big political lift, how'd you do that? She said, we talk equity. We talk about how the results of what we have hurt the people that you don't want to tell your children you are hurting. And even though people don't show up in support, they or have realized that the cost of keeping things as they are is one they don't want to continue to pay. So they have, and I know the equity word is not popular right now, but the bottom line, call it fairness, call it limiting opportunities, call it is that the lever here is to say uh, zoning has some racist roots and it's overly exclusionary. The answers are talk about the unintended consequences of it and talk about the need to exclude less and do the answer will be less different in every community, but every community can do something on these roads. And I'll close with this two quotes. I put quotes throughout the whole book. One of them is this guy who wrote, he's, by the way, the director of the film, The Big Short. Everywhere you turn, you see Americans sacrifice their long-term interest for short-term reward. And Chief Justice Earl Warren saying, everything I did in my life was worthwhile. I caught hell for. So, everything that you do that means something, someone's going to object to. So what? That's how the world moves forward. And so the last chapter of the book was just intended to inspire people and say, so, do you want to retire having said I didn't do much, or do you want to retire saying I took on some hard issues and we won or we lost, but I took them on? So, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, Don. Thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next month. I think the next one is on June 17th, if I have that date right. But refer to the flyer. It's got the next chapters on there. And we will keep having good discussions. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks.